If I told you that a missile the United States government officially killed 3 years ago is now hanging under the wing of a bomber flying combat missions over Iran, and nobody in Washington wants to explain why it's back, if that sentence made you pause, you need to hear the rest of this. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you're new here, and send this video to one person who still thinks they understand what's really happening in the skies over Iran. Because in the next few minutes, that understanding is going to change completely. Let's start with a simple picture. Early this year, near an American airbase in California, someone snapped a photo that looked almost boring at first. A B-1B Lancer bomber sitting on a runway doing what B-1B bombers do. But if you looked closely, underneath that massive aircraft was something that shouldn't have existed anymore. A long, sleek missile called the AGM-183A, mounted externally in plain sight. This wasn't just any weapon. This was a hypersonic missile built to fly faster than almost anything else in the sky. And here's the strange part. This exact program had been declared finished, dead, canceled by Congress years earlier after a string of failed tests drained the budget and drained everyone's patience along with it. So why was it back? And why now, at the exact moment American bombers were flying repeated missions into one of the most dangerous stretches of airspace on the planet? A canceled weapon does not casually reappear on a live combat aircraft in the middle of an active war. Something pushed it back into existence. Something made the Pentagon reach for a program it had thrown away and decide, actually, we need this after all. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that something was, and why Iran, despite everything it has tried to build and prepare, may not have a real answer for what's now flying toward it. To understand why this missile came back from the dead, you first have to understand the war that brought it back. Earlier this year, American and Israeli forces launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. It didn't start small. Within the first day, more than 1,000 targets across the country were hit. Stealth bombers, fighter jets, drones, and electronic warfare aircraft all moved together, blinding Iran's defenses and striking its most guarded facilities almost simultaneously. Senior figures inside Iran's military leadership were reported killed within those opening hours. This was never meant to be a one-day show of strength. This was the beginning of something much longer and much more serious. And it didn't come out of nowhere. Months earlier, American stealth bombers had already struck Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, dropping massive bunker-busting bombs meant to punch through mountains of rock and reinforced concrete. At the time, officials described that strike as a one-time event, a sharp, contained message meant to slow Iran down without dragging the whole region into open war. That's not how it played out. The tension never actually cooled. It simmered under the surface for weeks, while the United States quietly moved more forces into the region. Aircraft carriers, airborne units, special operations teams, all positioned under the official explanation of protecting civilians and preventing further escalation. Then, a little over a month later, the larger campaign began for real. Iran didn't just absorb the hits and stay quiet, it fought back hard. Ballistic missiles and drones were launched at American positions across the Gulf. Navy destroyers responded with their own missile strikes while defense systems worked around the clock trying to shoot down incoming fire. 2 American aircraft carriers were already sitting in the region when the fighting escalated. One in the Arabian Sea, another near Israel in the Mediterranean. At one point, Iran struck the United Arab Emirates directly, killing foreign workers and injuring dozens more in an attempt to reach American assets stationed there. People died on every side of this conflict. This has never been a war fought safely from a distance, and it has been expensive in ways most people never hear about. According to senior military officials, American forces intercepted more than 1,700 Iranian missiles and drones during the campaign. But every single interception costs money and costs supply. Reports indicate the United States burned through roughly 1,000 cruise missiles from a pre-war stockpile of about 3,000. On top of that, more than 1,000 long-range standoff missiles were used from an inventory of around 4,400. Precision-guided munitions from Army stockpiles were drained just as fast. Military planners and lawmakers back home started quietly panicking. This is supposed to be the most dominant military on Earth, fighting a country with a fraction of its resources. And yet warehouses of expensive precision weapons were emptying at a pace that alarmed the very people responsible for managing them. Think about what that actually means. If the stronger side is burning through its ammunition this fast against a weaker opponent, that's not just an inconvenient budget line, that's a warning sign. A signal about what a longer, harder war somewhere else in the world might actually look like, and whether America's current arsenal could even survive it. That single detail, quiet as it sounds, is one of the biggest reasons everything that follows in this story happened at all. Now let's talk about who's actually been doing the fighting up in that sky, because this is where the story starts connecting directly to that revived missile. The B-2 stealth bomber has carried an enormous share of the load. Fewer than 20 of these aircraft remain in active service, all flying out of a single base in Missouri, with retirement already planned for the early 2032s. The B-2's strange flying wing shape, its radar-absorbing skin, and its ability to fly more than 11,000 kilometers without refueling make it one of the only aircraft on Earth that can leave American soil, strike deep inside heavily defended territory, and come home again largely undetected. Throughout this entire campaign, not a single B-2 has reportedly been hit, not once. But something strange showed up on these bombers during the fighting, something worth pausing on because it shows just how secretive this whole operation really is. Ground crews photographed B-2 seconds preparing for missions, with unusual markings painted on their wings. Numbers that didn't match any publicly known weapons count or maintenance code that outside analysts could identify. Some guessed the markings tracked how many bunker-busting bombs each aircraft had dropped. Others weren't convinced that explanation even made sense. The honest truth is, nobody outside the program actually knows. The B-2 remains one of the most tightly guarded aircraft programs in the American military, and a lot of what it's doing in this war will likely stay classified long after the plane itself is retired. While the B-2 handled the deepest, most heavily defended targets, a second bomber stepped into this fight in a way it never had before. The B-1B Lancer. Built for speed and raw firepower rather than stealth, it was sent in to strike targets tied to Iran's military command structure. Multiple B-1Bs reportedly flew non-stop missions straight from the American mainland, carrying a payload larger than almost any other aircraft in the current fleet, hitting command centers and missile sites in the days following the opening leadership strikes. Unlike the B-2, the B-1B doesn't rely on invisibility. It relies on distance, speed, and sheer firepower, delivered in a single devastating pass. And this is exactly where our real story begins, because the B-1B has been doing something entirely new, something that connects directly back to that photograph from California. Images tied to testing at that base showed a B-1B flying with the AGM-183A mounted externally, clearly visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. That mattered because it marked the first time this specific bomber had ever been seen carrying that missile in this way. Officials have confirmed the broader air campaign was aimed at elements of Iran's security structure and locations, judged to pose an immediate threat. And the sudden appearance of this hypersonic-capable loadout lines up perfectly with that picture. Let's be careful here, because precision matters in a story like this one. What has actually been confirmed through named, on-record reporting is that the missile was photographed mounted on the aircraft, tied directly to the broader picture of this ongoing war. Whether that missile has actually been fired at a real target inside Iran has not been officially confirmed by military officials. What is confirmed is that this weapon is now physically present in the fight, mounted on a combat-ready aircraft, sitting in a war zone it had never operated in before. A weapon doesn't quietly get strapped onto an active bomber and flown into a live conflict just for decoration. That alone should make you pay attention. Alright, before we go deeper into how this missile actually works and why Iran might not be able to stop it, I want to hear from you. Drop a single word in the comments describing how you think this story ends. I read every single comment, and honestly, they shape what we dig into next. If you haven't already, now's the perfect moment to hit subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is coming, and you don't want to miss it. So, why does a missile hanging off a wing matter this much? Because 3 years ago, this exact program was supposed to be finished forever. Its history is almost hard to believe once you walk through it. This weapon began development years earlier with a bold promise. A missile that could be launched from a fighter or a bomber, climb roughly 100,000 feet into the sky, release a hypersonic glide vehicle, and steer that vehicle toward a target more than 1,000 miles away at speeds almost nothing on Earth could reliably catch. On paper, it sounded like the future of American air power. Then testing began, and things fell apart fast. One early test failed because the missile wouldn't even release from the aircraft carrying it. Another failed because the booster refused to ignite. A third was aborted before the missile could even fire. The program limped along for years, stumbling from one failure to the next. Eventually, the booster technology started working properly, and the first fully successful test flight actually happened. Just months later, another full test failed for reasons that were never made public. By that point, lawmakers had seen enough. Funding was zeroed out completely. On paper, this weapon was dead. A cautionary tale about ambition running far ahead of engineering reality. For a while, that really did seem like the end of it. Defense analysts wrote it off. Budget committees moved on to newer priorities. It became the kind of program people brought up as an example of good money chasing bad results. Here's where the story turns, and it's the part that gives this whole situation its weight. Quiet momentum had actually been building behind the scenes long before this war started, driven by defense planners who were increasingly nervous that the United States had no working air-launched hypersonic weapon of its own, unlike Russia, unlike China. But it was this specific war against Iran that finally forced the decision. The air campaign exposed two uncomfortable truths nobody could keep ignoring. First, how fast weapon stockpiles could drain fighting even a country widely seen as weaker and less equipped. Second, how valuable a fast, hard-to-intercept strike weapon would be against high-value, fast-moving targets, like mobile missile launchers that only sit still for a few minutes at a time. Budget requests for the following year reportedly included well over $200 million to fund a new version of this missile, sometimes described as its second stage of development, said to include a completely new guidance system capable of hitting moving targets, including ships at sea. A program that lawmakers had formally killed was back in the federal budget, back on an active combat aircraft, and back in a real war zone, all within roughly 3 years. It's worth understanding why this weapon was built in the first place, because that context makes its comeback even more meaningful. This program was never really designed with Iran in mind at all. It was built largely as a response to China and Russia, both of which had already developed and deployed their own operational hypersonic glide weapons years earlier. The United States, by comparison, had nothing equivalent ready to go. Other American hypersonic programs were either stuck in early testing or had only just become operational in a limited way. Seen through that lens, watching a previously canceled missile get rushed back onto an active bomber during a live war isn't only about hitting Iranian targets faster. It's a message aimed just as much at Beijing and Moscow as it is at Tehran, a signal that a capability gap rivals have pointed to for years might finally be closing. There's a strange irony sitting inside all of this if you think about it long enough. A weapon designed with China and Russia in mind ended up getting its real-world debut, or something very close to it, over Iran instead. Nobody planned it that way on paper. But wars rarely follow the script written years in advance in defense strategy documents. Sometimes a weapon built for one kind of enemy ends up proving itself against a completely different one, simply because that's where the chance to use it under real combat conditions showed up first. Now let's actually break down why a weapon like this is so hard to stop, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating instead of just dramatic. This missile belongs to a category called a boost glide hypersonic weapon. A solid rocket motor accelerates an unpowered glide vehicle up to extreme speed and altitude. Once the booster falls away, that glide vehicle doesn't follow a smooth, predictable curve the way a normal missile does. Instead, it flies low, fast, and unpredictably, adjusting its path mid-flight in ways that dramatically shrink the amount of time any defense system has to spot it, calculate where it's heading, and actually fire back in time. Traditional air defense systems, the kind Iran currently operates, are built around the assumption that a target follows a fairly stable, predictable path. A weapon that can suddenly change direction while flying at several times the speed of sound completely breaks that assumption. That's not exaggerated marketing language. That's the actual reason the United States, Russia, and China have poured billions of dollars into this exact category of weapon over the last decade. And Iran knows this gap exists, because it has spent years trying to build something similar of its own. Iran has claimed to possess and use its own hypersonic-labeled missile, reportedly firing it toward regional targets earlier this year. But here's an important detail any honest account has to include. Iran's hypersonic claims have been publicly challenged by independent defense analysts. Multiple outlets and researchers have described the labeling around Iran's weapon as questionable at best, with some experts saying the term obscures more than it actually explains for that particular system. In simple terms, Iran says it has a missile that can dodge modern missile defenses. Independent experts remain far less convinced it actually performs the way Tehran claims. That's a genuine, unresolved dispute, and it deserves to be stated honestly rather than glossed over. Now let's talk about just how weakened Iran's air defenses actually are, because that context is essential to judging whether the country has any real answer to a weapon like this at all. The backbone of Iran's strategic air defense network came years ago through a handful of advanced Russian-supplied systems positioned deliberately around the capital and around the country's nuclear sites. That network was never especially large to begin with, particularly compared to the hundreds of similar systems other major powers maintain for their own protection. And even that limited network had already been worn down significantly before this latest war even began, with key radar and tracking components destroyed in earlier strikes. As the campaign intensified, satellite images showed Iran scrambling to reposition whatever launchers it had left, a sign that some defense capability had survived the opening strikes, but only barely. Weeks into the campaign, military officials formally declared control of Iranian airspace, citing tens of thousands of combat missions flown and roughly 12,000 destroyed targets, alongside a dramatic drop in Iran's drone attacks and ballistic missile capability. Separate reporting indicated a large majority of Iran's weapons production facilities had been struck, crippling its ability to rebuild its defense industry for years to come. Other reports suggested most of Iran's missile launchers had already been taken out of action, and its navy had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. And yet, despite all of that, Iran's air defenses have been accurately described as battered but still biting, Because not long after those sweeping declarations of air superiority, an American fighter jet was shot down over western Iran, triggering a massive 2-day rescue operation involving hundreds of troops and dozens of aircraft. Special operations forces from multiple branches took part in recovering the downed crew, and the pilot was rescued roughly 7 hours after the crash. But that rescue came at a cost. American forces reportedly destroyed several of their own aircraft during the operation to prevent them from being captured, while Iran claimed to have damaged additional American aircraft during the engagement. Several Iranian military personnel were also reported killed in the same fight. This single incident matters enormously, because it's a reminder that even a badly degraded air defense network hasn't simply vanished. Portable, shoulder-fired defense systems are believed to have played a role in that shootdown, a reminder that even after losing most of its long-range radar-guided systems, Iran can still pose a real threat to aircraft flying at lower altitudes. Senior military officials have since cautioned that despite the impressive destruction numbers being reported, Iran's overall military capability had not been completely wiped out. Even as public statements elsewhere painted a picture of total victory, that distinction matters enormously for the weapon at the center of this story. A weakened, patchy air defense network built around aging systems might occasionally get lucky against a slower, non-stealth aircraft, the way it apparently did in that one incident. But those systems were designed decades ago around slow, predictable, non-maneuvering threats. A hypersonic glide vehicle capable of changing direction mid-flight at several times the speed of sound is a completely different category of problem, one that even fully intact, modern air defense networks around the world are still struggling to reliably solve. There have also been reports suggesting Iran may have quietly replaced parts of its damaged defense network with newer systems, along with unverified claims that additional foreign-supplied short- and medium-range defenses may have entered the country. Even taking the most generous version of those reports at face value, none of it changes the core physics problem underneath all of this. Nothing currently in Iran's known inventory, replenished or not, was designed to intercept a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle, and that is exactly the gap this revived American missile is meant to exploit. It's worth sitting with just how different this challenge is from anything Iran has faced before in this war. Shooting down a slow-moving drone is one kind of problem. Tracking a ballistic missile on a predictable arc is another difficult but at least mathematically solvable challenge, given the right radar and interceptor combination. A maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle throws that math out completely. Defense planners in multiple countries, not just Iran, have spent the last decade trying to design systems capable of reliably catching something moving this fast and changing direction this unpredictably. And most of those efforts are still years away from being proven reliable in actual combat. Iran, with a defense network already stretched thin and partially destroyed, is nowhere close to solving a problem that fully resourced, technologically advanced militaries haven't even solved yet. This hypersonic story doesn't exist in isolation either. There's a wider pattern of newer, lower-profile weapons quietly reshaping this entire conflict. And it's worth understanding because it shows this war has effectively become a live proving ground for next-generation military technology on both sides. Officials have confirmed the first real combat use of several previously untested systems during this campaign, including new precision strike missiles and unmanned combat platforms, while declining to release a full list of everything making its debut. From upgraded Iranian weapons to newly deployed American systems, this conflict has become a testing ground for hardware that had never been fired at a real adversary before. There's also a separate hypersonic weapon worth mentioning briefly, because it's easy to confuse with the one at the center of this story, even though it belongs to a completely different branch of the military. Reports emerged that Central Command had requested deployment of the Army's own long-delayed hypersonic weapon to the Middle East, specifically to strike Iranian missile launchers that had been repositioned beyond the range of existing precision weapons. If approved, this would mark the first ever operational deployment of that particular missile anywhere in the world. One defense analyst offered a fairly blunt take on that request, describing it as something close to a live demonstration, a chance for the Army to prove out a long-troubled weapons program in a real conflict against an adversary already significantly weakened. As of the most recent public reporting, that specific deployment remains a request under consideration rather than a confirmed action. So to be clear, that Army system is a separate, still pending story, while the missile now mounted on the B-1B is the one that has actually been photographed flying combat missions tied to this exact war. Different branches, different timelines, but the same underlying message. Washington is racing every hypersonic option it has toward this conflict as fast as it possibly can. There's a reason all of this is happening at once instead of one program moving forward at a time on its own careful schedule. Wars have a way of collapsing bureaucratic timelines. Programs that might have taken another 5 or 10 years of cautious peacetime testing suddenly get pushed forward in a matter of months, because the pressure to prove a capability works in front of a watching world becomes impossible to ignore. That pressure cuts both ways. It can produce genuine, battle-tested breakthroughs. It can also mean weapons get used in combat before every question about their reliability has actually been answered. Both of those things can be true about the exact same program at the exact same time. And this missile sits squarely in that uncomfortable middle ground right now. So, where does all of this leave us? A missile once treated as a punchline in defense budget hearings, a program that burned through billions of dollars and delivered failure after failure, is now strapped to the wing of an active combat bomber, flying missions, connected to one of the most closely watched wars on Earth. And Iran, along with every other country watching this unfold from the outside, now has to plan for the very real possibility that the next strike could arrive faster than anything currently sitting in its defense network is capable of stopping. There's something worth sitting with long after this video ends. A weapon that was declared dead, stripped of funding, and written off as a failure came roaring back within just a few years, once real pressure forced the question. And that raises an uncomfortable thought. How many other canceled programs are sitting quietly inside defense budgets right now? Not actually gone, just paused, waiting for the next crisis to justify pulling them back into the light. Does bringing a previously failed weapon back into an active war represent smart, fast adaptation to a real battlefield lesson? Or does it represent rushing an unproven system into a live conflict simply because the pressure to show technological dominance became impossible to resist? There isn't a clean, comfortable answer to that question yet. Reasonable people looking at exactly the same facts are landing in very different places on it. What do you think Iran's real options actually are if a weapon like this gets used in anger? Do you think this kind of rapid revival is the right call, or a dangerous shortcut being taken under wartime pressure? Whatever you believe, this is a story still being written in real time, one confirmed detail at a time, and it's one worth watching closely as it unfolds. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I'll see you in the next video.